Australia, Dr. Kieran.
Thanks very much, Vidya. Thanks to the Institute for making today possible, and also for the online sessions which have been extraordinary over the last few days, getting emails with all the presenters with the digital platform. It's been absolutely brilliant. Just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we meet and their ongoing connection to the land and waterways around us. So, the entropy of suffering. I have the joyous task in 15 minutes of trying to introduce you to the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Someone's laughing, which is good. That was actually a joke. I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to try and do today in the next few minutes is just, and it's interesting that they have put me first. It's kind of handy. Because if we're going to make advances in the way we think about data and what data means in terms of information, which is why we collect data, the work I undertook through my PhD, which was a 7-year journey to hell and back, but what I discovered through that process was that one of the fundamental missing ingredients is actually an understanding about the structure of things as they happen in emergency. And I'm talking about things in the grandest possible way. So when you look at how we conceptualize what happens in an ED, what happens in a hospital, what happens in a health service, when you actually challenge people and say, well, what's your theory? What's the theory about the structure of the universe that you say you're working in? And most people will give you a blank stare, kind of like 90% of the room right now, because we don't talk about theory a lot. But in fact, if we're ever going to make the kinds of gains that we've been promised from the digitisation of healthcare, we fundamentally have to understand the laws operating in the universe in which we're working. And this sort of, the standard PhD title, the entropy of suffering. So what emerged from that research is that there is a fundamental law of thermodynamics, the second law, the law of entropy. And it turns out that from the granular experience of suffering for the patient, the entire reason that a hospital, that a doctor, that a nurse, that it all exists is because of the suffering of the patient. The suffering calls us to action. And that suffering is actually an entropic function. There's actually a fundamental physical entity known as entropy, which actually drives the experience of suffering. And that fundamental entity also exists in the universe in which that suffering takes place. And so hospital emergency departments, hospital buildings, hospital healthcare architecture, the way we design the systems we measure and the data we collect is actually functioning in an entropic world. So, don't worry about the first definition there. That's a traditional definition that relates to other forms of system theory. The two we're interested in is entropy 2, which is the tendency of all systems towards equilibrium. So you'll often hear us talk about a thing called homeostasis in healthcare. The human body works within homeostatic boundaries. And we, unfortunately, make the misattribution that homeostasis means equilibrium, that things are in balance. That's actually fundamentally untrue. Things are not in equilibrium, they're actually a long way from equilibrium. So the tendency of all systems towards equilibrium, or towards chaos, is actually really important. Thirdly, and very importantly for us as people thinking about data, information, and making sense of things in what we measure, we have to understand that entropy is also about the compressibility of that data. So those data that we collect need to say something about the process underlying which has generated the data. And it turns out in information theory that the process for that is actually the same process that describes entropy in other systems. So that's kind of a miracle, kind of happy circumstance that was discovered in the mid part of the 20th century. So we need to understand how that all fits together. Simple example. So you're on the back of a truck. I'm living out in Western Queensland. This actually happens a lot, out with the cowboys and cowgirls, and we throw things off the back of utes. And I can tell you, they never land in a pile like that on the left. They always land in a pile on the right. That is fundamentally entropy. The most likely outcome for any system, eventually, is that the system will degrade into disorder and chaos. So just hold that image in your head. When we think about energy transformation in complex systems, we have to understand that the tendency is towards disorder, to the jumbled pile, not the neat standard brick wall. Having said that, what we do in healthcare is we actually build brick walls. So we don't allow the bricks to fall into a jumbled pile on the ground. We actually design systems, measure those systems, and evolve those systems so that we're more likely to build bricks. That is truly magic. So, theory, here we go, let's dive deep. So, Schrödinger, amongst his many extraordinary achievements, presented a seminar series, or actually wrote a book based on a seminar series in the 1930s and 40s, What is Life? And he predicted the structure of DNA. How did he do that? Because mathematically he fundamentally understood the fundamental laws of physics. And he said that life is so complex that it can only come from something which is not very complicated. And it has to have durability in time, so it has to have a crystal structure. And he predicted, and Watson and Crick acknowledged, and Rosalind, Rosalind Franklin, all three acknowledged that Schrödinger's work was really important in terms of their initial concepts of what to look for when it came to DNA. So he predicted it would be crystalline and it would be simple. 4 base pairs in a crystal structure. That's exactly what we've got. A liquid crystal, admittedly, but it's a crystal structure nonetheless. So when we understand the fundamental laws of things, as Schrödinger did, and he could express it in mathematics, he could make very profound fundamental predictions about what matters in the universe in which we exist in. So what is life? So the natural system that we exist in is a naturally learning system. We've heard lots and lots about learning organisations, and thanks to the 2 Davids at the beginning of the day, we said, don't think you're not in a learning organisation, you are in a learning organisation, because it's fundamentally part of what happens when humans come together. So we may not have optimised that system of learning, but we are all learning all the time, because natural systems always learn. And I want to give you a sort of apropos example of, I don't know, let's take a virus that infects humans. It's not very topical, but we'll stick with it. So what's happened here? So ecologically, the interaction of the human immune system with the universe around it has created a system that is actually extremely efficient at identifying something which is not me and organising itself to create an enduring memory of that thing which is not me in the form of immunoglobulins. Now, it doesn't need to read the entire genome of a virus to work that out. It knows that the virus has conserved aspects. So something about the ecological interaction of human immune systems and immune systems going back to our progenitors and the infection of a virus, that ecological encounter, has designed a system which knows that within the structure of that invading particle, there is something highly conserved. That is just how it is. And it knows how to find that and then to build a defence around it. So there is some uncertainty in that, but it's certainly not the accident of life. And so these theories build on the premise that there isn't an accident of life. Darwin wasn't correct. He's correct in other ways, but fundamentally isn't correct that there's just this kind of randomness to things. That actually can't be true, and the mathematics don't support it. So to give you a quick example here, what we're looking at here is just a petri dish of metal particles, and on the left-hand side, this is what we call maximum entropy. There's no describable relationship between those little particles. It would take all the data that we could gather about that petri dish of particles in order to describe that petri dish. We'd have to know everything about every particle. Pass an electric current through it, and for reasons we don't understand still, passing electric current through it, it organises itself. The particles organise themselves, and they organise themselves into a relationship which is describable in less amount of data than the whole system contains. So this is really, really important. So a system which is non-linear, which is non-equilibrium, organises itself, like the right-hand side diagram there, organises itself, naturally organises itself into something which doesn't require us to know all the data about every aspect. We only need to know some of the data because it gives us enough information about what the system is going to look And this is a really, really important thing for us to come to understand in terms of information and entropy when we start to think about the universe we live in. So, as I said, the process isn't random. And that fact that it's not random means that we can make some fairly quick heuristic leaps. It means that we don't need to know about every brick in the wall. We can measure things like its level and its volume and its direction in 3 dimensions of space. And we can interpret from that, those few pieces of data, lots and lots and lots of information about the process that built that wall. We don't need to know about every brick. And so if you think about what's happening in healthcare, where we see this enormous elaboration of data, collecting data on all sorts of aspects of the process of healthcare, has anyone asked the right question? And that right question is, do these data actually tell me something about the process? Or even more fundamentally, is that process something which I anticipate is more random or less random? Because that will dictate the type of data we need in order to make sense of the system. But what we have to understand is that in natural systems, in ecological systems, randomness is not normal. It's there, and it happens, but the system will always tend to order in ecological systems. I'm going to explain why. So, the perfect equilibrium in human beings is death. It's actually perfect equilibrium. So, human beings aren't in perfect equilibrium. In fact, we're far from it. And so, as a non-linear, non-equilibrium system, it means that we can maintain 2 important things that we do in our bodies and in the systems that we design. We create dissipative structures and coupled irreversible reactions. And I can't go into the maths in detail because there's not enough time, but fundamentally, these are well-described physical entities, dissipative structures and coupled irreversible reactions. What they allow is a system far from equilibrium, like a human being and the systems that we design. It allows us to be anti-entropic. So we are able to create systems, we are able to live in embodied bodies that violate the second law of thermodynamics. And they violate that second law of thermodynamics because in the biosphere in which we live, we're able to reverse entropy, but actually at the universal scale, we're all tending towards death anyway. So it's just kind of your perspective which changes. So we're not truly violating the second law of thermodynamics. It's just that in ecological systems, we have these dissipative structures and coupled irreversible reactions that at the local scale make it seem like we are. And they are fundamentally what allows life to exist. Now in my work, when I looked at dissipative structures and coupled irreversible reactions in the emergency department, which was the focus of my research, don't worry about digesting that diagram, it's just to say there is a model, and there are models that actually make sense of physical systems that are fundamentally formed with dissipative and irreversible reactions. And so we need to stop thinking about mechanistic models of healthcare, mechanistic models of input, throughput and output in the emergency department, which was the pinnacle of model definition in my research over the last 7 years, to understand, no, that's not actually describing the truth. The truth is, it's all complex. And so the ED comes into being because of the suffering of the patient. There's an ethical bond that's created between society, which builds and maintains hospitals and emergency departments, trains nurses and doctors and healthcare providers. There is an ethical bond which says, we will do this for you because you're suffering, because when I'm suffering, you will do the same for me. So there's a profound ethical bond. That ethical bond is built around the inescapable reality of entropy in all systems. So when I suffer, I am tending towards disorder. So we've built structures, hospitals, emergency departments, that are anti-entropic, that take what is unknown, the suffering of the patient, and turn it into what is known, a diagnosis, a treatment, an outcome. So those things, it can sound very esoteric, but it's actually fundamentally describing a truth about the system we're operating in. Just lastly, the obsession with the brick is part of the problem we face when we think about the structure of data and knowledge. We've become obsessed with defining the bricks. That's okay to a point, but we can't lose sight of the fact that actually in these systems, we don't need to know everything about every brick. We need to fundamentally start to understand how the wall is built. And when we understand that, we can let go of a lot of data that is actually unnecessary. And there's a whole model for how you do that in informational theory around the entropy of information. So we need to move away from these mechanical models of describing what happens in emergency and start to truly embrace their actual complexity. So the phenomena of ecological interactions is real, and that's what we need to study. So we need to step away from our attempts to model and focus much more on observing what we're really seeing. And it turns out when we do that, we introduce the potential for us to think about the structure of things in fundamental ways. Thanks very much.